June 4th, 1942. Midway Atoll. Dawn light bleeds across the Pacific as the first TBF Avengers of Torpedo Squadron 8 rumble down the coral airstrip, their right cyclone engines shaking the ground like distant thunder. Salt wind sweeps across the cockpit canopies and rattles control surfaces. Inside each aircraft, pilots fight the tremor in their hands as the weight of the torpedo beneath their bellies drags the nose heavy. The smell of aviation fuel mixes with the sting of metal and ocean spray. These planes are new, untested in true combat, and every man aboard knows it. Ensign Albert Ernest forces his Avenger into the sky. The heavy aircraft claws upward, its wings flexing under the strain. A crewman in the turret calls out headings over the intercom, his voice tight but steady. Below them, Midway shrinks to a pale ring of sand surrounded by endless blue. Ahead lies the unknown. Radio static crackles. Other pilots breathe hard, trying to suppress the mix of fear and anticipation that settles like a stone in the gut. They know what they are flying into. Japanese carrier air groups have swept across the Pacific, defeating every enemy placed in front of them. Their Zero fighters reign uncontested at altitude. Japanese pilots mock the American torpedo planes, calling them slow and clumsy. The Avenger's bulky frame and sluggish roll rate make it an inviting target. But this morning, VT-8 has no choice. Intelligence reports place a powerful Japanese carrier strike force steaming toward Midway. The Avengers must find it, shadow it, and if they can, strike it. It feels like suicide. Cloud cover thins as the squadron pushes deeper into the open ocean. Ernest scans the horizon. Nothing but shimmering water. Minutes drag like hours. The cyclone engine hums steadily, the prop arc shimmering in the growing sunlight. Then the turret gunner shouts. Movement ahead. Dark specks rising in the sky. Zeros. They come in fast, silver-green shapes slicing downward like blades, sunlight flashing off their wings. Ernest's heart rate spikes. He drops altitude, trying to stay low over the water, but the torpedo's weight makes evasive movement almost impossible. The first bursts of cannon fire rip across the sky, tracers sizzling past the canopy. The formation disintegrates under the assault. One Avenger erupts into flame and dives into the sea. Another spirals downward, trailing black smoke. Radio calls fill the air, voices strained, some cut off abruptly. Ernest clenches the stick, pushes forward, trying to bring his aircraft into a torpedo run. But the Japanese fighters stay glued to the Americans, hammering them from above. He presses on. Water spray lashes the underside of the aircraft as he skims dangerously low. The torpedo is armed and ready. Ahead, through the smoke and chaos, he glimpses the towering silhouette of a Japanese carrier. But another burst of cannon fire tears through his wing and shreds control cables. He releases the torpedo, unsure if it will run true. Seconds later, the Avenger shudders violently. The turret gunner is hit. The radio operator slumps over his panel, blood soaking the equipment. Ernest fights the controls, wrestling the crippled aircraft away from the swarm of Zeros. The sea rises to meet him. He barely keeps the Avenger from crashing outright. As he limps away, Japanese fighters peel off, abandoning the wounded American plane. To them, it is already dead. Reports later reveal what the Japanese pilots laughed about. The new American torpedo bomber was too slow, too heavy, too easy to kill. They believed no pilot flying such a machine could threaten the Imperial Navy. Ernest coaxes the damaged aircraft back toward Midway. Smoke leaks into the cockpit. Instruments flicker. He checks on his crew but receives no reply. Hours seem to pass as the horizon finally reveals a thin line of land. The landing gear refuses to extend. Ernest belly lands the Avenger on the strip, metal screeching as sparks trail behind. Emergency crews rush forward. Only one other Avenger from VT-8 returns, and it is riddled with holes. Half the squadron never makes it back. The ground crews stare in silence at the wrecks. Midway's defenders whisper that the new torpedo bomber has failed its first test. Japanese intelligence officers record that the aircraft posed no credible threat. Among Japanese pilots, it becomes a joke, a lumbering target that can be plucked from the sky at will. But beneath the Japanese victory reports, a detail goes unnoticed. The Avengers found the enemy fleet. Their presence forced Japanese commanders to react, to change course, to prepare for another wave. And another wave was already coming. Beneath the rising smoke over the Pacific, as the battles around Midway erupted in full fury, the significance of that brief Avenger encounter began to surface. When the American dive bombers suddenly appeared high above the Japanese carriers, their timing seemed uncanny. From the Japanese perspective, no American aircraft had been close enough to guide such an attack. But in the after-action evaluations aboard Akagi's surviving staff ships, scattered reports quietly noted that the first hostile contact that morning had come not from bombers, but from a handful of new American torpedo planes pressing dangerously close to the task force. Hours earlier, those same Avengers had forced Japanese destroyers and screening cruisers to maneuver violently. Lookouts had shouted bearings. Captains had barked orders to adjust heading. And in that brief turbulence, when attention shifted low toward the sea, the unseen dive bomber formations were already descending from above. The Japanese had mocked the Avengers' sluggishness, yet their own records revealed that those slow planes created the opening that allowed American bombers to strike with devastating precision. On Midway's airstrip, Albert Ernest sat on a stretcher as corpsmen worked over his shattered crew positions. His flight suit smelled of smoke and salt water. Around him lay twisted metal, torn fabric, and fragments of the aircraft that had carried him into the jaws of the most experienced fighter groups in the world. The weight of the losses hit him hard, yet in the distance, the sky continued to thrum with aircraft returning from the great battle. Word spread. Multiple Japanese carriers were burning. As the shattered remnants of Torpedo Squadron 8 were counted, naval intelligence teams moved quickly, questioning Ernest and the few others who survived the morning run. They traced flight paths, drew lines on charts, and compared them with the reports from dive bomber squadrons. The Avengers' early contact with the enemy force provided essential bearings that helped coordinate the subsequent strikes. Even in their failure to land torpedo hits, the aircraft had played a crucial role. On the other side of the ocean, aboard a Japanese cruiser transmitting back to Yokosuka, senior staff officers pored over fragmented radio logs. Pilots returning to their carriers spoke with a mix of confidence and puzzlement. They repeated the same opinion. The new American torpedo plane was heavy and unmaneuverable. But they also reported that the Avengers were appearing farther out at sea than expected, ranging deeper into areas once thought safe. They kept showing up, damaged, scattered, sometimes alone, but persistent. Something in their endurance unsettled certain officers, who understood that technological threats often announced themselves quietly before erupting into genuine danger. In Pearl Harbor, the surviving Avengers were examined with meticulous care. Engineers and squadron leaders gathered around the bullet holes that riddled the aircraft, tracing the paths of incoming rounds, noting where armor plating had held and where it had failed. They compared the Avengers' endurance to the older TBD Devastator, whose catastrophic losses had nearly erased torpedo squadrons entirely. By contrast, the Avengers' tougher frame, more powerful engine, and extended range offered hope. Pilots discussed new approaches, Stay low until the final run, coordinate with dive bombers, integrate with PBY scout planes to find the enemy first. Tactics began to shift. Throughout the summer of 1942, in airfields stretching from Hawaii to the newly contested Solomon Islands, the Avenger's reputation among American crews quietly grew. Pilots respected its ruggedness. Crewmen praised the space and visibility in its compartments. Mechanics liked its reliability under harsh conditions. When new squadrons deployed to forward positions, the Avenger became a reassuring presence, a machine that could take punishment and still bring its crew home. Meanwhile, Japanese analysts began to notice something troubling. Reports from destroyer captains in the Solomons described being shadowed by single Avengers at dusk, their silhouettes darkening against crimson sunsets. Pilots escorting convoy to Guadalcanal spoke of persistent American torpedo planes flying low over the waves, refusing to break contact. These sightings forced adjustments. Ships tightened formation. Anti-aircraft crews remained at stations longer. Fuel consumption increased as evasive maneuvers were ordered. The aircraft the Imperial Navy had dismissed as a joke was beginning to steal time, attention, and resources. In the humid nights at Rabaul, staff officers studied maps under dim lanterns. They marked the locations where Avengers had been spotted and matched them with later attacks. Patterns emerged. The Americans were learning faster than expected. The enemy torpedo bomber that had failed at Midway was returning, more frequently and with growing confidence. Japanese airmen still joked about the Avenger's clumsiness, but their commanders were no longer laughing. By late summer, a new question circulated quietly within the ranks of Japan's Naval Air Command. If this heavy American plane survived its flaws and adapted its tactics, what might it become? Autumn rain hammered the jungle canopy on Guadalcanal, as crews of the newly arrived TBF Avengers prepared their aircraft in the dim pre-dawn light. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the scent of mud, oil, and rotting vegetation. Ground crews worked in silence, checking fuel lines, hoisting torpedoes, wiping moisture from canopy glass. Every man on Henderson Field felt the tension that came with the nightly bombardments from Japanese cruisers prowling iron-bottom sound. Tonight, the Avengers would go out to meet them. Lieutenant Harold Ellison tightened the straps on his flight harness as he climbed into the cockpit. The Cyclone engine sputtered, coughed, then roared awake with a shaking rumble that vibrated through the wet earth. His turret gunner, already drenched from the rain, slammed the hatch shut and rotated the turret to test its movement. Over the intercom, the radio operator muttered coordinates whispered to him by a Marine scout who had spent the night listening for distant propellers and engine echoes off the water. When the Avengers lifted off, they disappeared into a ceiling of dark clouds. The sea below was a black void, except for the faint glimmer of moonlight reflecting off swells. Ellison eased the aircraft lower, dropping until the prop wash flung spray across the windscreen. The air smelled of salt and gasoline, and the constant hum of the engine felt like a heartbeat beneath his boots. Miles ahead, a Japanese supply convoy crept down the slot, protected by destroyers and a pair of cruisers. Their lookouts scanned the sky for the familiar shapes of dive bombers or B-17s, not expecting torpedo planes to be hunting in the darkness. Japanese command believed night operations were beyond the capability of these heavy American aircraft. Ellison intended to prove otherwise. A whispered transmission crackled into his headset. One of the other Avengers had spotted silhouettes on the water. Ellison banked gently, letting the aircraft hug the waves. The first flashes of Japanese searchlights sliced through the night, sweeping arcs across the sea. Shells burst overhead, sending fragments tinkling against the fuselage. The Avengers spread out, each pilot maneuvering for his torpedo run. Ellison steadied the aircraft, his torpedo armed. The altimeter hovered just above the waves. The cruiser ahead loomed larger, its superstructure rising like a dark mountain. Gun crews spotted his approach and opened fire. Tracers streaked toward him, crossing the water in orange lines. He forced the aircraft lower, so low the spray briefly blinded the windscreen. The torpedo slipped free with a heavy jolt. He pulled up sharply, engines straining. The cruiser kept firing, but its rounds now fell behind him. His turret gunner shouted that the torpedo was running true. Seconds later, a dull flash lit the underside of the clouds. A muffled blast rolled across the water. Radio chatter confirmed it. One of the Japanese cruisers had taken a hit. The Avengers regrouped in the dark and climbed into the clouds, leaving behind burning wreckage and a confused Japanese escort force scrambling to respond. Their return to Henderson Field came at sunrise. Mechanics and Marines watched in disbelief as the Avengers rolled to a stop, riddled with shrapnel but intact. Ellison and his men crawled out of the aircraft, exhausted and soaked, but grinning. Throughout the Solomon Islands campaign, missions like this multiplied. Avengers stalked Japanese barges at night, striking when crews least expected them. They hunted destroyers that attempted high-speed reinforcement runs. They harassed convoys during storms, their heavy frames steady in turbulent weather that grounded lighter aircraft. Each success tipped the balance just a little further. Reports flowed into Rabaul and up the chain of command. Japanese captains who once dismissed the Avenger as a clumsy intruder now warned of its persistence. Locators noted that the Americans were using the aircraft in ways Japanese planners had never anticipated. Night attacks, long-range reconnaissance, coordinated strikes with dive bombers and fighters. When a second Japanese cruiser suffered torpedo damage near the end of the year, the laughter stopped entirely. In staff meetings aboard the battleship Yamato, officers reviewed charts showing the expanding range of American carrier aircraft. The Avenger's endurance meant it could shadow fleets for hours, directing other attack groups. Its torpedoes, once considered unreliable, were improving. Pilots flying the aircraft were gaining hard-earned confidence. On Guadalcanal, Ellison and his squadron mates prepared for the next phase of the war as Japanese forces withdrew from the island. They knew the Avenger had changed. It was no longer the untested machine that bled over Midway. Now it was a weapon with teeth, trusted by crews and feared by those who sailed against it. The Pacific was widening, and the Avenger was flying into the heart of it. By early 1943, the Solomons had become a battleground shaped by darkness, rain, and sudden violence. But as the United States pressed northwest toward the Central Pacific, the Avengers found themselves operating in broader skies and against larger, more heavily defended targets. Carrier decks buzzed with activity as new torpedo squadrons formed, their pilots hardened by months of combat. The Avenger, once a curiosity, had become a fixture of every major operation. In November, during the push toward the Gilbert Islands, Avengers launched from escort carriers to suppress Japanese resistance at Tarawa. Their targets shifted from cruisers and destroyers to bunkers, ammunition dumps, and enemy supply ships. The aircraft's versatility surprised even its own crews. Bomb racks replaced torpedoes. Depth charges were loaded for anti-submarine patrols. The Avenger evolved into a multi-role weapon, but its torpedo strike capability remained the heart of its legend. As 1944 dawned, the U.S. Navy prepared to strike deeper than ever before. Ahead lay the Marshall Islands, where powerful Japanese garrisons protected key naval bases. The Japanese High Command believed the incoming carriers would face their well-fortified defenses head-on. Instead, American task forces applied a new method. Coordinated radar-directed strikes. Ships with advanced radar systems scanned the horizon, plotting enemy movements and guiding air groups with increasing precision. On the morning of January 29th, aboard USS Bunker Hill, Lieutenant Commander James Glenn stood beside his Avenger as armorers secured a Mark 13 torpedo under its belly. The metal casing gleamed in the pale light. Glenn listened to the ship's 1MC echo across the deck as spotters confirmed a cluster of Japanese vessels near Kwajalein. Among them was the light cruiser Katori, escorted by destroyers. Glenn climbed into the cockpit. The flight deck trembled as engines spooled up around him. He closed the canopy, sealing himself inside the familiar mixture of fuel fumes and metal. When the launch officer signaled, the Avenger roared forward and leapt from the deck into a humid sky streaked with the colors of dawn. The formation climbed to altitude. Clouds towered ahead, their edges glowing white in the sunlight. Glenn eased his aircraft into position, the Avenger's wings steady and sure. Radio calls crackled. Radar from a nearby battleship confirmed multiple contacts. They were closing fast. As the task force drew near Kwajalein, the Japanese convoy came into view, a tight concentration of vessels navigating between reefs. Glenn rolled his Avenger onto a descent path. The torpedo beneath him seemed to pull at the aircraft, making each turn deliberate and heavy. Below, Japanese gunners spotted the incoming formation and opened fire. Tracers arced upward in bright paths. The sea erupted with geysers from exploding shells. Glenn steadied his breathing. The cruiser's long silhouette filled the windscreen. He dropped lower, letting the Avengers skim the waves. The noise grew deafening, wind tearing at the canopy, the engine straining, the thump of enemy rounds slamming into the wings. The Katori's port guns flashed violently, trying to break his approach. Glenn released the torpedo. The aircraft jumped upward as the weight fell away. Instantly he pulled back, climbing hard through sheets of fire. The torpedo sped across the water, its wake barely visible beneath the chaos. Seconds later, a sharp white plume burst from the cruiser's side. The concussion carried through the air. Glenn's turret gunner let out a shout. The Katori slowed, smoke pouring from a jagged wound amidships. Other Avengers pressed their attacks. A destroyer maneuvered sharply to avoid one torpedo, exposing its flank to another. More explosions flared across the surface. The Japanese formation began to break apart. The once orderly convoy twisted into a disorganized scatter of ships trying to escape the gauntlet. By midday, Katori had taken multiple hits and drifted helplessly as American cruisers moved in to finish the job. The Avenger crews returned to their carriers brimming with adrenaline and disbelief. The air crews crowded on deck as Glenn's riddled aircraft taxied to a halt. Mechanics swarmed over it, counting holes, tracing shrapnel paths. One man tapped the fuselage and smirked that the plane seemed made of iron. But far out in the Pacific, the Japanese staff officers were no longer joking about the Avenger's toughness. Reports from Kwajalein reached Rabaul and Tokyo with chilling clarity. The American torpedo bomber, once dismissed as a lumbering target, had crippled and sunk a cruiser under heavy escort. Radar-guided coordination made the attacks more precise than ever. Past assumptions were failing. As American carriers expanded their operations across the Marshalls and toward the Marianas, Japanese commanders faced a growing realization. Each time the Americans advanced, the Avenger was at the forefront. Each month, its crews became more skilled, and each strike grew more devastating. Ahead lay the battles of 1944, where the Avenger would prove itself capable of something even more unthinkable. It could bring battleships to their knees. The sun rose over the Philippine Sea in June 1944, with a sharp, blinding glare that turned the water into a field of molten silver. On the flight deck of USS Lexington, Rows of TBF Avengers sat lined and armed, their torpedoes glinting in the heat. Pilots and crew moved through final checks with the steady focus of men who knew the day might tilt the balance of the Pacific War. American scouts had sighted elements of the Japanese mobile fleet, and with them came rumors of newly deployed battleships and carriers sailing to confront the American invasion of the Marianas. Lieutenant Sam McKee wiped sweat from his brow as he climbed into his Avenger. The metal seat was hot from the rising sun. The deck vibrated beneath him as engines across the carrier group roared alive, each sound feeding into a deep, thundering chorus. The air smelled of exhaust, salt, and hot steel. He slid the canopy shut. His turret gunner secured the hatch behind him. In the tight, enclosed space, he felt the vibration of the torpedo slung beneath the aircraft like the heartbeat of a living thing. When the launch officer signaled, McKee's Avenger surged forward and dropped from the deck into open sky. He leveled off, joining his formation as they turned west. Below them, the vast Pacific shimmered with rising vapor. Ahead lay a distant smudge of smoke. The Japanese fleet. As the Avengers approached, Japanese fighters rose to meet them. Zeros streaked through the clouds, diving with their familiar, predatory grace. But unlike the early months of the war, American Hellcats waited for them. Radio calls lit the air. Blue flashes of gunfire winked through the sky as battles raged overhead. McKee pushed his Avenger lower, skimming the cloud bases to avoid the worst of the fight. Turbulence jostled the aircraft. His gunner called out enemy positions, but for the moment, the Avengers pressed on. Then the Japanese fleet emerged from a bank of clouds. Battleships and cruisers carved white wakes across the sea, their decks bristling with anti-aircraft guns. The giant battleship Musashi led the formation, its thick armor gleaming in the sunlight. To many Japanese officers, Musashi and her sister ship Yamato represented the core of their naval power. They believed no aircraft could destroy such massive floating fortresses. McKee angled toward one of the trailing battleships, Haruna. Fountains of flak erupted around him, sending black smoke rolling across the sky. Fragments clattered against the wings. The Avenger jolted under each near miss. He gripped the control column tighter, arms shaking as he forced the aircraft downward. The sea rushed up to meet him. The roar of the engine mixed with the shriek of wind around the canopy. Haruna's forward turrets fired, sending towering geysers upward. McKee dropped lower, wings nearly touching the spray. The torpedo beneath him felt like a lead weight holding the aircraft down. His gunner shouted. They were in the run. McKee steadied the aircraft, lining up the battleship's hull. The water blurred beneath the Avenger. Tracers streaked past in sheets of orange and white. Something slammed into the fuselage behind him. Warning lights flickered on his panel, but he held course. Haruna grew larger, details sharpened. Crew scrambling across the deck, anti-aircraft guns spinning toward him. He released the torpedo. The Avenger lurched upward as the load fell away. McKee pulled hard on the stick, climbing through a maelstrom of flak. A blast rocked the air beneath him as another Avenger's torpedo detonated against a destroyer. Radio calls filled his headphones. Shouts, instructions, brief cries cut off too quickly. Below, his torpedo ran straight. Within seconds, a bright flash tore through Haruna's port side. A plume of fire and water erupted skyward. The battleship shuddered, losing speed as smoke poured from the wound. On nearby ships, Japanese lookouts stared in disbelief. A vessel their navy believed nearly invulnerable had taken a crippling torpedo hit from an aircraft they had once mocked. The Avengers regrouped and fled east, battered but intact. McKee's right wing was stitched with holes. The turret mechanism jammed, Fuel leaked from a ruptured line. Yet the Avenger held together, carrying its crew home across the endless blue. 4 months later, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Avengers returned to challenge the core of the Japanese fleet. Under violent skies and driving rain, they struck again at Musashi as she tried to force a path toward American landing forces. Waves of Avengers launched torpedoes from both sides, coordinating with dive bombers that hammered the giant ship's deck. One hit after another rocked Musashi until the great battleship listed, slowed, and finally sank beneath the waves in a thunderous collapse of steel and steam. From the bridge of Yamato, Japanese officers watched the destruction unfold. They stood in silence, the weight of realization settling on them. The heavy American torpedo bomber they had once dismissed as slow and clumsy had become one of the deadliest predators in the Pacific. It could kill cruisers, it could cripple battleships, it could sink symbols of national pride. And it never seemed to stop coming. As 1945 unfolded, Avengers swarmed over the retreating Japanese empire, hunting submarines, tracking convoys, and launching torpedo strikes that shattered the last remnants of resistance. Their engines echoed across the Philippines, the South China Sea, and the approaches to Okinawa. Everywhere the Imperial Navy sailed, the Avenger followed. When the war finally ended, Japanese naval officers recorded quiet assessments in their final reports. Among the pages were simple conclusions written without humor or dismissal. The American TBF Avenger had become one of the most formidable weapons of the Pacific War. They had mocked it, and then it had brought their battleships to the bottom of the sea.